G'day guys, my name's Nick and welcome to my channel Low Range Nick, where I do videos about four-wheel driving, accessory fitting and maintenance for your four-wheel drive vehicle. So in today's video I'm going to be talking all about power steering. So how the power steering system works and also how we can maintain the fluid in the steering system to make sure that it's working A1 for years to come. So firstly we'll begin with the steering wheel. So obviously when we turn the steering wheel, that is transmitting drive from the steering wheel through into the steering column, which is mounted in behind these trims. Then we jump down into the footwell, and this is the extended shaft here, which goes through the firewall there. So you can see I'm turning the steering wheel now, and that's turning the extended shaft, so the steering shaft, and then that goes through the firewall grommet and then down to the steering rack. So here you can see the steering column joining to the rack, and this joins to the pinion in the rack, and then the pinion drives down onto the actual steering rack. So when the drive comes from the steering shaft down into the pinion, it then rotates and moves the rack back and forth depending on which way the pinion is rotating, and this in turn moves the rack ends and the tie rod ends out to each wheel, which moves the wheels back and forth. And what you can see here are some hydraulic power steering fluid lines. So the power steering pump actually supplies high pressure power steering fluid to the steering rack to assist with the turning of the wheels. So now we've talked about how the steering system works, let's talk about how the power steering assist system actually works to assist the steering rack with high pressure fluid. So our power steering system begins with our fluid reservoir. So this is the reservoir that supplies the power steering pump with the fluid and also gets the return fluid from the system after it's done going through the rack. So I've just jumped under the vehicle now, and what you can see here is the power steering pump. So this is run off the front of the engine, and this line here is the supply line from the reservoir up the top there that I was showing you earlier, and that fluid comes into the pump. And then a little bit hard to see, but this line here goes up to a hard line on the top of the pump there, and this is the high pressure supply line which goes down and to the steering rack. So you can see that hard line there going into the steering rack. You can also see the other hard line coming out, which is the return line, which goes back up to the reservoir. So the power steering pump supplies high pressure fluid to the power steering rack to assist with the turning of the wheels. This makes the steering light, and it also makes it really easy to turn even if you have larger tyres fitted to your vehicle. So power steering fluid is normally one of the most neglected fluids. However, in the Isuzu service manual, power steering fluid should be changed at 90,000 Ks, and it also recommends to change a power steering hose as well. So most people don't actually replace the hose, they just check it, and on my vehicle it looks perfectly fine. So I'm going to leave the hose, but I'm going to flush the power steering fluid system and also change the fluid. So to change the power steering oil and also flush the system, we're going to require some power steering fluid. So if you're not sure on what fluid your vehicle takes, usually it's stamped on the top of the cap of the power steering fluid reservoir. Worst case, if it's not stamped there, you can just check your owner's manual and it should tell you in there the fluid that it recommends. So the recommended fluid for my 2018 Isuzu MUX is Dexron 3 Multi-Vehicle Premium Mineral Auto Trans Fluid. So this is a 1 litre bottle, and this should be sufficient to carry out a flush and oil change on the system. So for today's flush, I'm going to be using a large syringe and a little bit of clear tubing to suck the fluid out of the reservoir. You can also use a turkey baster or vacuum suction pump, so it's completely up to you what method you use to get the fluid out of the reservoir. But basically all we need to do is just suck the fluid out of this main power steering reservoir here, and we're going to dispose of it into our clear jug. Alrighty, so we'll take the power steering reservoir cap off. We're going to put our clear hose down to the bottom of the res, and then we're just going to suck into the syringe as much of that old fluid as possible, and we're just going to dispose of it into our clear jug over there. So now I've sucked about 150 ml of power steering fluid out of the reservoir. So you can see the fluid is pretty dark, so it's a good time to be replacing this fluid before it gets any worse. And what you'll notice is when you're sucking the fluid out of the reservoir, there is a little filter down in there, so you can't actually put the suction pump or your syringe in my case all the way to the bottom of the res to suck all the fluid out. So the main reason that we are sucking the fluid out of the res is just to reduce the amount of mess when we jump under the vehicle and catch the fluid when we take off a power steering hose. So what we're going to do now is jump under the vehicle, and I'll show you guys which hose we need to pull off the power steering pump to drain all of the fluid out of the system and enable us to carry out the flush. So now we're under the vehicle. You can see here the power steering pump. So we're just on the front of the engine here, and this is the crank here and the fans right here. So it's just located sort of down the bottom left hand side of the engine. And what we're going to do is just loosen off these two 12mm bolts, and we're going to pop this hose out and drain all the fluid down into our bucket. So there is a little rubber hose up here that we could take off, but I think by removing this actual fitting from the power steering pump, we're going to be able to get a lot more fluid out of that system. Alright, so we can remove these two 12mm bolts now from the power steering pump. So now I've removed my bolts from the line on the power steering pump. I've got my big drain tray down here, and I've also got a bit of cardboard here just to protect the concrete. So I ended up rigging up a little funnel here, which is just hooked onto this power steering line up here, and it sits right under where this is going to drain. And then I've put the funnel down into my little jug, and then it's onto the big drain tray underneath. So I'm going to try and minimize the amount of mess as much as possible. So I'm going to see how this goes, and hopefully it'll catch all of the power steering fluid in the system. So I'll just give this fitting a bit of a wobble, and it should be on some little rubber O-rings. So now we'll just let all of that fluid drain out and down into our container, and what we're going to do next is turn the wheels side to side and allow that fluid to pump through the system and pump out of our little hose here. So now I've drained all the old fluid out of the power steering system. I've got about 600 mils of power steering fluid in my little measuring jug. So by turning the wheels back and forth, you can pump all of that old fluid out of the system and make sure that we flush it all out and replenish it with fresh fluid afterwards. So what I can do now is put the power steering line back on the power steering pump, tighten my two bolts, and I'll jump back up to the top of the vehicle and we can start bleeding the system. Now what we can do is top it up with our fresh fluid, and we'll just top the reservoir right up to the brim. So for our first fill, we do want to fill the reservoir right up to the brim because we will have a fair bit of air in the system which we need to bleed out. So you can see I've filled the reservoir right up to the top. So what we're going to do now is, because I have the vehicle jacked up and the wheels off the ground, now we can turn the wheels left to right. What that's going to do is help bleed and push that air through the system and bring it out of the reservoir. So you can see that the fluid in the reservoir has fallen a fair bit, but it's still above the max line. So what we can do is keep turning those wheels until the fluid level stops dropping. So now I've carried out quite a few turns left to right. You can see that the fluid level has dropped all the way down. So what we're going to do is just keep topping that up. We'll top it all the way back up to max now. So we've done our initial bleed, and now we can just top it back up to the max mark and keep turning the wheels and making sure that it doesn't drop anymore. So when we get to a point when our power steering fluid isn't dropping anymore, even though we're turning our wheels left to right, what we can do then is actually start the engine and allow that power steering pump to circulate the fluid through the system. So we'll just start the engine for a couple of seconds and then flick it straight off. Then we'll come out and check the reservoir level and make sure that it hasn't dropped too much. So it's always a good idea just to start the vehicle for a couple of seconds and then come out and check the res, just to make sure that it's not running dry in the reservoir. So now we know that when we start the vehicle, the reservoir isn't running dry. So what we can do is actually start the vehicle up, and we can start turning the wheel left to right now. We can carry out the same procedure and make sure that we get all of the air out of the system. So continue to top it up, turn the wheel with the engine running, and then we'll double check the fluid level after we've done a couple of turns and make sure that it's not running dry. So now I've finished turning the wheels left to right with the engine running. I've continuously topped up the fluid level so it stays on the max mark. Now I also checked underneath the vehicle on my fitting on the power steering pump to make sure that there was no leaks. So what you can see here is a bit of a side-by-side comparison of the old fluid and the new fluid. So you can see the new fluid is a nice red colour here, and it's pretty transparent. You can see through it pretty well. And on this side you can see the old fluid is quite dark, and it's really difficult to see through this fluid. So it's a really good time to change the fluid at 90,000 Ks. If you leave it any longer, it can cause issues with the power steering system, cause noises, notchiness in your steering, and other issues down the track. So this fluid should be good for another 90,000 Ks until I need to change it again. So if you are chasing a power steering noise, and that's the reason that you're carrying out this flush, or you have sort of notchy steering or some sort of issue with the power steering, then what you may need to do is carry out a power steering flush. So if your fluid is really dark, if you're not sure of the service history, or if it smells really burnt, you may need to actually flush the fluid again. So what you do in this process is you would carry out a flush at this point. Once we've put our fresh fluid in, worked it through a couple of times, you'd carry out another flush just as I showed you before, draining it from that power steering line on the pump, and then you'd replenish it with fresh fluid, and that should get 100% of that old fluid out of the system and replenish it with this nice fresh fluid. So let's jump under the vehicle, we'll give it a bit of a clean down, we'll chuck those bash plates back on and get off the jack stands. Alrighty guys, so we're all back together now, and I've dropped the vehicle back on the ground. So now what we can do is start the engine up. We can turn those wheels left to right now that the load's on the power steering, and we can just bleed the final little bits of air out of that system and double check our level in the reservoir. Now we've turned the wheels a couple of times with the vehicle on the ground, we should have bled all of that air out of the system, and we know we did the job right because the fluid level didn't drop at all in the reservoir. So that means we got all of the air out of the system before we dropped the vehicle on the ground and put load on the power steering system. So now we know our power steering fluid level is spot on. We can put our cap back on the reservoir, and now we can just clean down the engine bay and underneath the vehicle where we spilt some power steering fluid. And what we can do is a final road test and double check the fluid level after a decent drive. So thanks a lot for watching guys, and if you do have any comments or feedback, just let me know down in the comments section below, and I'll be keen to hear what you guys have to say. So thanks again for watching guys. If you did enjoy today's video, please give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for more four-wheel driving, accessory fitting, and maintenance videos. Cheers guys.